প্ৰিয় শ্ৰোতা, আজি ৰেডিঅ' ক্লাছৰুমত উপস্থিত আছে আমজঙাত অৱস্থিত পণ্ডিত দীনদয়াল উপাধ্যায় আদৰ্শ মহাবিদ্যালয়ৰ ইংৰাজী বিভাগৰ সহকাৰী অধ্যাপিকা ডক্টৰ সুদীপ্তা ফুকন বাইদেউ। বাইদেউ, আপোনাক আমাৰ ষ্টুডিঅ'লৈ বহুত বহুত স্বাগতম।
ধন্যবাদ। Hello students, today I am going to talk about a topic entitled A Literature of Their Own, Ellen Showalter and Gynocriticism. This topic is prescribed for 5th Sem students for English major under CBSE course. Ellen Showalter was born on January 21st, 1941. She is an American literary critic, feminist, and writer on cultural and social issues. She influenced feminist literary criticism in the United States academia, developing the concept and practice of gynocritics, a term describing the study of women as writers. She has written and edited numerous books and articles focused on a variety of subjects, from feminist literary criticism to fashion, sometimes sparking controversy, especially with her work on illness. Showalter has been a television critic for People magazine and a commentator on BBC radio and television. She is a recipient of the Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism. Showalter is a specialist in Victorian literature and the fin de siècle or turn of the 19th century. Her most innovative work in this field is in madness and hysteria in literature, especially in women's writing and in the portrayal of female characters. She is the Avalon Foundation Professor Emerita. Her academic honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship. She is also the past president of the Modern Language Association, known as MLA. In 2007, Showalter was chair of the judges for the prestigious British Literary Award, the Man Booker International Prize. In 2012, she also received an honorary degree from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Showalter has written and edited many works. Some of them are A Literature of Their Own, Towards a Feminist Poetics, The Female Malady, Women, Madness and English Culture, 1830 to 1980, Sexual Anarchy, Gender and Culture at the Fin de Siècle, Sister's Choice, Tradition and Change in American Women's Writing, Histories, Hysterical Epidemics and Modern Media, Inventing Herself, Claiming a Feminist Intellectual Heritage, Faculty Towers, the academic novel and its discontents. Viewing the women's literary tradition in terms of three phases, Showalter has divided women's literature into three phases in her work in Towards a Feminist Poetics. Showalter traces the history of women's literature, suggesting that it can be divided into the feminine, feminist, and female. The feminine phase, starting from 1840 to 1880, where women wrote in an effort to equal the intellectual achievements of the male culture and internalized its assumptions about female nature. The first phase thus focuses on women writers like George Eliot, who wrote with male pseudonym. The second phase, called the feminist, stresses from 1880 to 1920, was characterized by women's writing that protested against male standards and values and advocated women's rights and values, including a demand for autonomy. The third stage, the female phase, starting from 1920, which is continuing, is one of self-discovery. Showalter says that women reject both imitation and protest, two forms of dependency, and turn instead to female experience as the source of an autonomous art, extending the feminist analysis of culture to the forms and techniques of literature. Showalter points out that although women writers since the beginning have shared a covert solidarity with other women writers and their female audience, there was no expressive communality or self-awareness before the 1840s. Even during the feminine phase, women writers did not see their writing as an expression of their female experiences. Yet, the repressive circumstances gave rise to innovative and covert ways to express their inner life, and thus we have the mad woman locked in the attic, the crippled artist, and the murderous wife. Despite the restrictions, the novel from Jane Austen to George Eliot talked about the daily lives and values of women within a family and community. In the feminist phase, which denotes political involvement, women writers questioned the stereotypes and challenged the restrictions of women's language, denounced the ethic of self-sacrifice, and used their fictional dramatization of oppression to bring about social and political changes. They embodied a declaration of independence in the female tradition and stood up to the male establishment in an outspoken manner, challenging the monopoly of the male press. Many feminist journals came into being, and some of, like Virginia Woolf, controlled their own press. The female phase was marked by courageous self-exploration and a return to more realistic modes of expression. Post-1960, writers like Doris Lessing, Muriel Spark, Iris Murdoch, and Margaret Drabble undertook an authentic anger and sexuality as sources of creative power, while reasserting their continuity with women writers of the past. Rejecting both imitation and protest, Showalter advocated approaching feminist criticism from a cultural perspective in the current female phase, rather than from perspectives that traditionally come from an androcentric perspective like psychoanalytic and biological theories. For example, feminists in the past have worked within these traditions by revising and criticizing female representations or lack thereof in the male traditions. In her essay, Feminist Criticism in the Wilderness, written in 1981, Showalter says, I quote, "A cultural theory acknowledges that there are important differences between women as writers. Class, race, nationality, and history are literary determinants as significant as gender. Nevertheless, women's culture forms a collective experience within the cultural whole, an experience that binds women writers to each other over time and space." Showalter's another book, Inventing Herself, written in 2001, The Survey of Feminist Icons, was the culmination of a lengthy interest in communicating the importance of understanding feminist tradition. Showalter's early essays and editorial works in the late 1970s and the 1980s survey the history of the feminist tradition within the wilderness of literary theory and criticism. Working in the field of feminist literary theory and criticism, which was just emerging as a serious scholarly pursuit in universities in the 1970s, Showalter's writing reflects a conscious effort to convey the importance of mapping her discipline's past in order to both ground it in substantive theory and amass a knowledge base that will be able to inform a path for future feminist academic pursuit. Showalter does not advocate replacing psychoanalysis, for example, with cultural anthropology. Rather, she suggests that approaching women's writing from a cultural perspective is one among many valid perspectives that will uncover female traditions. However, cultural anthropology and social history are especially fruitful because they can perhaps offer us a terminology and a diagram of women's cultural situation. Showalter's caveat is that feminist critics must use cultural analysis as ways to understand what women write, rather than to dictate what they ought to write. When first published in 1977, A Literature of Their Own by Ellen Showalter quickly set the stage for the creative explosion of feminist literary studies that transformed the field in the 1980s. Launching a major new area for literary investigation, the book uncovered the long but neglected tradition of women writers in England. Showalter's A Literature of Their Own is an academic monograph and work of literary criticism. As such, it exhibits particular characteristics to which readers should pay close attention. First, an academic monograph is a scholarly work that focuses on professional research about a topic. Scholars usually have in some aspect of a topic and make a claim about it. They then develop the claim throughout the monograph using an authoritative voice, solid evidence, and strong reasoning. Her A Literature of Their Own discusses the female literary tradition, which she analyzes as an evolution through three phases. She observes that literary subcultures, that is, Black, Jewish, Anglo-Indian, tend to pass through these stages. Stage 1, imitation of the modes of the dominant tradition and internalization of the artistic and social values. Number 2, protest against these standards and values and a call for autonomy. And the third, self-discovery, turning into free from some of the dependency of opposition, a search for identity. In the book, Showalter showed how, by examining a plethora of women writers beyond George Eliot and Jane Austen, readers and scholars could discover a lost female literary tradition. This female literary tradition of literature, she argued, had been rendered invisible by patriarchal definitions of what was important. The book established a canon of works by women that reflected an evolving female consciousness, and it explored the ways in which women writers created a literature of their own, launching a major new area for literary investigation and reshaping the canon of English literature. A Literature of Their Own helped to create an explosion of intellectual ferment throughout the humanities that sought to establish gender as a category of analysis. Showalter's primary claim is that these women writers have yet to receive enough scholarly attention, and the picture of their efforts has been skewed to focus on only a few significant authors like George Eliot or Virginia Woolf. To get a fuller picture of women's writing, Showalter proposes to examine the lost works by women writers and the lesser-known writers themselves. They, too, made contributions to women's literature. To support her claim and fulfill her purpose, Showalter uses primarily expository and descriptive writing. Expository writing introduces something new or relatively unknown, while descriptive writing gets into the specific details in such a way as to present a thorough picture of the topic. For example, Showalter exposes lesser-known women writers and lesser-known details about more famous writers. She introduces her readers to women like Elizabeth Sewell and Mary B. Braddon. She discusses both their lives and their writing in great detail. She describes who these women were, talks about the motives behind their writing, and analyzes the plots and themes of their works. Showalter also uses expository and descriptive writing when she discusses the movements that influenced women writers. She presents both sides of the suffrage movement, for instance, so that readers receive a balanced view. She explores the female aesthetic with the same even-handed treatment, presenting its positive and negative aspects. Indeed, Showalter's clear claim, effective use of expository and descriptive writing, and balanced approach give her an authoritative voice. She knows that she is talking about, and readers can take her seriously. Her consistent use of solid evidence enhances Showalter's authoritative voice. The author draws her evidence from both primary and secondary sources. Primary sources come from the women writers and their contemporaries and include literary works, letters, journals, critics, and other such documents. Secondary sources are what other scholars write about women novelists. When Showalter discusses Olive Schreiner, for instance, she refers directly to the women writers' novels, quoting and analyzing them. She also draws from Schreiner's letters. These are primary sources. Her secondary sources include other works of literary criticism that present varying views of Schreiner and exciting details about her life and work. As a scholar, Showalter relies on her strong reasoning abilities to mold her claim and evidence into one narrative that enlightens and convinces readers. Showalter's close reasoning appear, for instance, when she disputes the ideas of other scholars. In her chapter on Virginia Woolf, the author acknowledges the normal critical acclaim for Woolf and her androgynous vision. Still, then she explores how that vision played out in reality. While androgyny is attractive, she reasons, like all utopian ideals, androgyny lacks zest and energy. She then proceeds to show how Woolf's vision of androgyny led her into isolation and misery, for the writer could not access the depths of the female experience or live them meaningfully. Ellen Showalter, while talking about feminist criticism, discusses that it falls into two categories: women as reader, that is feminist critic, and women as writer, which is gynocriticism. In the first category, women are consumers of a male-produced literature, and this aspect of feminist criticism is concerned with the stereotypical representations of women, features in male-oriented literary theory, and how patriarchy manipulated the female audiences. Gynocriticism, on the other hand, attempts to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature and focus on female subjectivity, female language, and female literary career. Gynocriticism or gynocritics is the term coined in the 70s by Ellen Showalter to describe a new literary project intended to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature. Gynocritics is related to feminist research in history, anthropology, psychology, and sociology, all of which developed hypotheses of a female subculture, including not only the ascribed status and the internalized constructs of femininity, but also the occupations, interactions, and consciousness of women. She coined the term gynocritics to describe literary criticism based on a female perspective. She gives a base description of gynocritics in her work Towards a Feminist Poetics thus, I quote, In contrast to an angry or loving fixation on male literature, the program of gynocritics is to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature, to develop new models based on the study of female experience rather than to adapt male models and theories. Gynocritics begins at the point when we free ourselves from the linear absolutes of male literary history, stop trying to fit women between the lines of the male tradition, and focus instead on the newly visible world of female culture. This does not mean that the goal of gynocritics is to erase the difference between male and female writing. Gynocritics is not on a pilgrimage to the promised land in which gender would lose its power, in which all texts would be sexless and equal like angels. Rather, gynocritics aims to understand women's writing not as a product of sexism but as a fundamental aspect of female reality. Showalter acknowledges the difficulty of defining the unique difference of women's writing, which she says is a slippery and demanding task in feminist criticism in the wilderness. She says that gynocritics may never succeed in understanding the spatial differences of women's writing or realize a distinct female literary tradition. But with grounding in theory and historical research, Showalter sees gynocriticism as a way to learn something solid, enduring, and real about the relation of women to literary culture. She stresses heavily the need to free ourselves from the linear absolute of male literary history. That is going to be the point where gynocritics made a beginning. Gynocriticism also examines the female struggle for identity and the social construct of gender. According to Ellen Showalter, gynocritics is the study of not only the female as a gender status, but also the internalized consciousness of the female, the uncovering of the female subculture and exposition of a female model is the intention of gynocriticism, comprising recognition of a distinct female canon where a female identity is sought free from the masculine definitions and oppositions. Gynocriticism, accordingly, challenged a Freudian psychoanalytic perspective whereby the female inherently suffers envy of man and feelings of inadequacy and injustice, combined with feelings of intellectual inferiority, arguing that male phallic prejudice itself creates a female consciousness that demands a critique, and that prejudice against the female incites a specific noesis that gets attributed to the female. Gynocriticism states that this prejudice has concealed the female literary tradition to the point of imitating the masculine. Thus, gynocriticism is a critical study of women's literature that is no longer occupied with women's relationships, roles, and their treatment in a patriarchal literary society and world. Instead, it tries to study women's literature by focusing on their internal struggle and experiences, their relationships with other women, and their receptions about life. To quote from George Eliot from her essay Silly Novels by Lady Novelists, "We are not dependent on arguing to prove that fiction is a department of literature in which women can, after their kind, fully equal men. A cluster of great names, both living and dead, rush to our memories in evidence that women can produce novels not only fine, but among the very finest novels too that have a precious speciality lying quite apart from masculine aptitudes and experiences." Coming to the conclusion, Ellen Showalter combined gynocentric rereading of canonical female authors with an examination of unknown writers in an attempt to revolutionize the accepted canon by questioning the criteria by which classic novels were defined. Showalter, like Millet, helped to expose the artificiality and subjectivity of the seemingly objective value judgments that surrounded literary analysis. The re-emergence of novelists from previous decades helped to disprove the assumption that women had not been significantly engaged with literary production. Women, it has shown, had written, and they had written in significant quantities. This went some way towards redressing the balance of gender representation in literary studies, although it still weighed heavily in men's favor. Thus, Showalter's works changed the direction of feminist criticism. She re-exposed writers that had long been forgotten to thoughtful assessment of their work and contributed to the new appetite for women's literature. Women's writing, she argued, formed a subculture within the literary tradition. It had its own characteristics, its own patterns and themes, and its own distinct identity. To fully understand how women's writing differed from the dominant male literature required a critical reading that was appropriate to these differences. Only a gender-specific analysis of women's writing, argued Showalter, would be sensitive to its motivations and expressions. To apply traditional critical methods and assumptions would be to force female artistic expression into an ill-fitting male mold. By ignoring the gender of novelists such as Jane Austen and George Eliot, some real and important insights into their work had been lost. So Showalter argued that it was time for women novelists to be considered as women and not as sexless aberrations from the male tradition. Thank you.